My name is Jordan Oster. I'm the Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council, and I'm excited to welcome you today to our annual Iowa Electric Generation Condition of the State webinar. Each year, IEC's Senior Energy Policy Counsel, Steve Geyer, analyzes the state of Iowa's energy generation, where emissions are coming from, and the impacts Iowa's remaining fossil fuel generation has on our environment, health, and pocketbooks. For today, I want to share a few presentation guidelines. We're going to be in a webinar format. Your camera and microphone will be off by default. We have a Q&A tool that you can see at the bar at the bottom. That is the best place for you to type in your questions as you have them during the presentation or when we have time for Q&A after the presentation. We also have a chat tool here. If you're having any technical issues, feel free to jump in the chat and hopefully we can get those addressed for you right away. Quickly, I'd like to introduce the Iowa Environmental Council. If you're not aware, IEC is the largest environmental coalition in the state. We work primarily on clean energy and clean water, and we're committed to addressing both the climate crisis and issues of environmental justice. We actively work on federal, state, and local public policy and engage Iowans statewide to build a just, healthy environment and a sustainable future for all Iowans. We represent over 100 membership organizations across the state, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit. Next, I'll introduce our speaker for today, Steve Geyer. Steve brings experience and leadership in the energy field in the state of Iowa. Since 2008, Steve has owned and led GWA International, a solar installation company designed and installed solar systems on the federal courthouse in Cedar Rapids, Iowa DNR facilities, and homes and businesses across the state. Prior to operating his own company, Steve held several key environmental positions with Iowa Utilities, analyzing environmental laws and impacts, providing counsel on environmental compliance, conducted due diligence, and other critical environmental duties. Steve is an Iowa native, and he holds a JD from the University of Iowa, a BA in physics from the University of Northern Iowa, and an AA in electronics engineering from Hawkeye Institute of Technology in Waterloo. With that, I'll turn it over to Steve Geyer for our presentation.
Thanks, Jordan, and appreciate everyone who's joining me today. I'm going to start basically with a blanket statement that climate change is costing Iowa businesses, families, governments, and taxpayers $1 billion of basically per year. And as we look at the presentation today and recognize that climate change is not going away, I want us to keep in mind that energy, the environment, and the economy are actually inextricably linked. Thank you for that. Yes. So what do we have as a goal? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report in April of 22. And what they set out was, in fact, a guideline that will allow us to avoid the greatest impacts from climate change. To do that, we need to achieve net zero by 2050. What that means is that it's not, basically just power plants. It's all forms of greenhouse gas emissions that need to be controlled by that point in time. But importantly, to make that work, the electric sector has to achieve that level by 2035, meaning not just coal plants, but gas plants also. And that because electricity serves as a foundation for many of the other forms of, I'll just say, emitters, in particular transportation and the building sector, we need to achieve that so that those sectors can actually achieve it. Otherwise, either will be delayed or maybe make it impossible for them to meet those targets. So what is Iowa's contribution to climate change? Every year, the DNR puts together a greenhouse gas emissions inventory to sort of track the progress that we've made over time. As we'll see, 2023, and it's always a year behind. So 2023 is the latest emissions guide. And in that year, 16% of the emissions came from the power plants. Agriculture was and continues to be the largest sector of our greenhouse gas emissions. But you'll also notice that the residential sector, commercial sector, and then transportation. Those are two items that clearly are also major contributors. Now, the percentages are just that, the actual tonnages that were emitted. So we emitted 126 million metric tons total in 2023. That is an improvement. That's down from basically a little bit, but more importantly, power plant emissions is where we're seeing some decline. And so in 2023, we've moved down to basically 20 million metric tons. Previously, 24 million metric tons were emitted in 2021. So we've seen a 15% decline in the actual emissions from power plants. Oops. I jumped ahead. So if we take a look at that a different way, this is actually then progress being tracked over time from 2005. And so what we'll see is power plants clearly have been showing some progress over that time, and they have declined over that same time. However, you'll notice that the industrial processes, the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use, and the ag sector really have not seen that much improvement. In fact, some of them have actually increased over that same timeline. So again, recognizing that power plants recognize that that stirs the foundation for the other sectors, but then also recognizing that we have a tremendous amount of building stock that needs to be turned over in order for that to be accomplished. In other words, net zero by 2050. So let's focus just then on the power plant emissions or IO generation. And so what is that looking like basically over time? So this tracks back to 2000. Importantly here, we'll notice that wind basically is our major source of energy now. Coal has been significantly declining. In fact, at a point in time in 2000, you'll recognize that coal was almost all of our generation at that point in time. Notably, in 2014, we've seen an uptick in natural gas being basically utilized. But overall, wind basically now represents the major source. And we had a crossover point basically in 2019 where wind overtook coal generation. And 60% of Iowa's generation is now basically, over 60% actually, generated from wind. So that is certainly helping us. Now, in terms of that natural gas, if we take a reflection back on the climate change aspects and the carbon dioxide, recognize that admittedly, I mean, coal has more impact in terms of climate change. Basically for the coal generation, about 2 tons of CO2 is emitted for every megawatt hour, whereas natural gas is about 1 ton, so about roughly half. But still, you have carbon dioxide being emitted. Once again, jumping ahead. So why are we seeing this shift in generation? It's because of the cost. And so as we look at basically generation, this is a slide from Lazard's. And so they track the progress every year, basically, in terms of what is generation actually costing us. What we'll see from this slide is that solar and wind actually are the lowest cost forms of generation. At the bottom, you'll see the conventional generation, which is, coal, natural gas, nuclear. All of those sources are more expensive today than basically the renewables. And yes, let's look at the aspects of, you might hear, well, but for the tax credit, it would not be viable. Well, that's not true either, because what you're looking at is actually the unsubsidized cost for these energy sources. So even without tax credits, renewables actually serve as a lowest cost option for our generation needs. Now, if we have tax credits, it certainly makes it a more viable and lower cost form of generation, but it still beats out fossil fuels even without that. So what is the 2024 resource mix? What's it look like? So we see, as I noted before, we've been seeing change. So for Mid-American, in 2024, 64% of the generation actually came from wind. Alliant basically saw 37% from wind. Notably, we'll see the remaining fossil use basically from each utility, where for Mid-American, that has now declined to 26%. In other words, the 21% coal and 5% natural gas, whereas Alliant has seen quite an increase actually in natural gas. So 50% of theirs is now natural gas. and 12% coal. So although we've seen more wind, certainly 62% of their generation still is from a fossil resource. So let's focus on those coal plants for a little bit. So I want everyone to be aware that there are 6 coal plants remaining in the state. But this is the ownership portions of those. Maybe some people don't recognize that the plants are not just Mid-American or Reliant, because they may be operators of the plants, but that doesn't mean that the ownership is strictly with those operators. And so this is a breakdown of basically each plant, and Mid-American, Reliant, and more importantly, the cooperatives and various municipal utilities actually own portions of all of these plants. When you sum basically then the actual ownership from the cooperatives and the municipals, actually it ends up equating to roughly one of the plants, about the size of a Tacoma generating station, or roughly in the 725 basically megawatts. So think of it as one of those 6 then is basically dedicated to either the municipals and or cooperatives. So Mid-American Reliant, what was the generation then? So beyond the percentages, so the megawatt hours generated. So we basically still end up with about 10 million megawatt hours being generated from coal, but the improvement has been in the wind. So wind basically between the 2 utilities totaled over 30 million megawatt hours. So certainly that is an improvement in overall, not only generation mix, but overall fewer emissions are being emitted. So look at that from a different perspective. These are the actual plants that we're talking about for Mid-American Reliant, or if I go back to that spreadsheet that had the percentages, these are the plants, or at least most of them on there. Some of these are owned only by one company. So on the right-hand side of both the Alliant and the Mid-American, so Emory, Marshalltown, and Greater Des Moines are all combined cycle natural gas plants. You'll notice that up on the Alliant, that's where you see, and they're generating a lot of energy from those 2 gas plants, equating back to that 50% of their overall mix. Then we have basically the coal plants. And you'll see variability over time, this is just the past 5 years, by the way. But overall, we're seeing, I'll say, a marked difference in terms of the utilization of various plants based on the year. But the trend can correspond to the overall trend we're seeing as far as downward utilization of coal, but maybe an increased utilization in terms of natural gas. So why is this important? So let's look at those same coal plants and the emissions from those coal plants. So this is a basically 2024 basically quantification of the sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, and carbon dioxide emissions from the coal plants that basically we've seen previously, again, either operated by Alliant or Mid-American. And so we'll see that sulfur dioxide emissions were almost 8,000 basically tons. Similarly, nitrogen oxide, a little over 9,000, 72 pounds of mercury, which is actually surprisingly, I'll just say, impactful. It may not seem like a lot, but it's impactful in terms of it doesn't take much mercury to contaminate a large body of water. And then the carbon dioxide emissions basically being at roughly 14 million tons. So what's the impact from this? So there are several externalities that are associated with burning coal. One of those, and EPA has a model, basically just acronym is COBRA. COBRA can be used to basically then quantify the health impacts from burning coal and from those plants. And when we run those plants that we're looking at here, COBRA tells us that those range basically from 110 million to 150 million per year, based on just the emissions that we're looking at right there, because it's emission-based, it's not plant-based emissions-based. Also, there was a study, I believe in 2023, that looked at PM 2.5 emissions from these plants, and it established that we had the possibility of premature death that occurs from these plants, again associated with the PM 2.5, the study period was from 1999 to 2020. And so overall, basically what we have is a situation where 340 Iowans basically saw a premature death from that time frame. And then I'll have another slide shortly here that shows if we extrapolate that, what does that actually mean? So here's both an extrapolation and also then where are these plants that we're talking about? So Neil 3 and Neil 4, just for purposes of letting people know, are just south of Sioux City. Walter Scott 3 and 4 are roughly Council Bluffs, on the south side of Council Bluffs. Ottumwa generating station outside of Ottumwa, technically it's Chillicothe, just outside of Ottumwa. And then Louisa is actually just to the south and east of Muscatine. When we look at that study and we extrapolate them, what the deaths have been, the deaths basically that are attributable to not only those from that study, but if we take that all the way back to the date that these plants started operation, which we'll see on this slide, many of them have been around for quite a while, 75, 79, 81, 83, 78. The only one that is in the 2000s is Walter Scott 4. So if we extrapolate and look at all of those, by 2020, that represented 7,576 Iowans experienced a premature death due to these plants. Importantly, these plants are still operating. So even though that's extrapolation to 2020, it means that we could also then expect future death, premature deaths to occur until these plants actually close. In this case, those dates right now are Neil 3 at 2035, Neil 4, Louisa, Ottumwa, and Walter Scott 3 at 2040, Walter Scott 4 all the way out to 2049. So certainly an impact, not only in terms of health costs, but premature death. What's another cost? So social cost of carbon is an economic, basically harm, and a value is placed on that. The most recent, quantification of dollars in terms of harm for social cost range from $128 per metric ton to $356. When we take a look at that, and then we also look at the nitrogen oxides, which has, by the way, a greater impact as far as climate change impact, you'll notice that that was $39,000 basically to $92,000 per metric ton. Based on then the amount that was emitted by Alliant and Mid-American, which was the 12.82 metric tons of carbon dioxide and 8.4 of nitrous oxides, that ranges then from $1.9 billion to $5.3 billion, basically from the emissions last year. And another study, which I'll just say has been confirmed, and the original study basically was looking at an impact in terms of closure of coal plants. And in fact, the study actually involved a couple of Iowa units when Neil 1 and Neil 2 closed. This is actually a representation then of corn loss, because what happened was they saw a rebound in corn yields in basically 2/3 of Iowa's counties after those plants closed. So the study concluded that in essence, you have a lost opportunity here of 1 million bushels to 5 million bushels per county per year. So similar analogy and calculation, when we take a look at that in terms of what that means in terms of lost corn production, and then look at the 2024 average price, that represented $287 million to $1.4 billion of lost opportunity, basically due on corn loss, again, from the operation of the coal facilities. So what is the true cost of coal? So certainly, we can add all of these together. And so when we sum that up, you'll notice that basically, and then divide this, by the way, by the amount of coal generation that was actually produced from these plants, that sums out to anywhere from 24 cents to 70 cents per kilowatt hour as an externality. Or in other words, costs that you're bearing, and in fact, not just Alliant and Mid-American, but every Iowan basically is bearing these costs due to the operation of these facilities. And I'll just point out probably later too, but air pollution does not discriminate. Everybody has to suffer and is burdened by basically this impact, not only financially, but otherwise. So what does that mean in terms of what is actually recognized by the utilities? And then again, the externalities as far as what is the true cost we're bearing, whether it's insurance rates or healthcare costs, et cetera. So the FERC form is used by the utilities to report their operating costs. And so you'll notice that we have the coal plants listed here. On the right-hand side, a select number of wind facilities and solar facilities have been identified also. And so this is certainly, I'll just say noteworthy. The lowest cost recognized from basically one of the coal plants is 2 cents. At least this was 2024 at Walter Scott 3. But if I add my externalities, then realistically, I'm suffering a burden of 25 cents to 71 cents per kilowatt hour, as impacting me. Also recognizing too, back to the aspect of this is not just Mid-American and Alliant customers. These are costs that are being borne by all Iowans, whether you're a cooperative customer or a muni customer. Importantly, let's look at the wind. So wind, this is a Mid-American farm, a wind farm, Intrepid, 1 cent per kilowatt hour was the recognized operating cost for that facility. So you have, if we take the maximum, the representation that coal is 70 times more expensive than the wind facility. In fact, the other ones you'll look there, so Franklin, which is an Alliant farm, and then Holiday Creek, which is Mid-American Solar, those are fractions of a cent. So much, much more expensive for the fossil plants, even if we didn't take the externalities into account. So what's our objective here? If we want to go back to the aspects of meeting climate change and being net zero. Both companies, by the way, have said that they want to be net zero by 2050. Well, to do that, we have to have a plan. And we certainly need to have something laid out that is transparent and that recognizes, the ability to get there. What we're seeing here in the green bars is a representation of the energy that is basically then sold to the respective utility customers. And so in the gold bars, that's the energy they produce that's sold to other utilities. And so as a percentage, we'll notice that Mid-American for 2024, 32% of their overall energy went to other utilities. And basically for Alliant, it was 14%. How's that translate back to goals? So when we hear that, for instance, utility says that maybe they have achieved 100% renewable, we need to be understanding what actually that means, because what it really means and what they're really accounting for is they're offsetting the sales to the utilities, sales to the retail customer, not the utilities. So only retail customer megawatt hours count basically when they're looking at whether or not they're 100% renewable. Again, true transparency says we need to look at all generation, not just coal, not just gas, but all generation to actually achieve that goal. And in fact, even though this is just a short time frame of 2020 to 2024, the Mid-American sales to utilities increased by 28% over that time, and the customer sales increased by 13% over that time. On the flip side, the Alliant sales decreased by 28% to utilities, while the customer sales decreased by 2% over that same time frame. So what's a path to 100% renewable? So wind and solar in 2024 actually represented 67% of our generation. That places us certainly ahead of any other state as far as the percentage generation from renewables. It also means that we are uniquely positioned to actually achieve 100% carbon-free by 2035. I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. I will also mention the One Big Beautiful Bill in terms of the impacts of that. So even though the Inflation Reduction Act was providing incentives out through 2032, those have been, I'll just say, the timeline has been changed. The credits are still there. So the only thing that's changed with the Big Beautiful Bill, because the domestic content 10%, the energy community 10%, the PTC, the ITC of 30, the ITC of 30%, PTC is all still there. It's just a matter that what changed with the Big Beautiful Bill is the timeline. And so the timeline says that the utility, in order to qualify for these now, two big things occurred. One is that they have to start construction by July 4th of next year, or be in service by the end of 27. If they start construction by next year, then they have the ability to actually complete their construction by 2029, 2030, depending on when you actually start construction. Notably, the ITC, the tax credits for batteries, is unchanged, and it actually remains all the way throughout the original 2032 date. The other thing that changed with the Big Beautiful Bill is, due to an executive order, the start of construction guidance changed as far as what does that mean. Previously, a utility could do a safe harbor by spending 5% of the overall project cost, and that would then preserve that tax credit. The guidance that's been given changed that. The 5% went away, and so now you actually have to have a different form of start of construction. You either have to physically start construction, or you have to enter a binding contract, and you have to demonstrate continual progress that is being made on your actual timeline. So, for instance, a wind facility could enter a binding contract for the actual wind turbines, and that would qualify as at least the start of construction. And then as long as you make progress, still qualify for the actual tax credits. So there's certainly urgency here. And I'll just say that even though there was an urgency back with the IRA, that has been exponentially increased now due to the Big Beautiful Bill. So part of what's going on too, in terms of this urgency, we have a significant growth projected as far as what's going to happen within the MISO region, Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and it's big. The projection, as you'll see, so in 2024, we were just shy of 70 terawatt hours consumed in Iowa by Iowa consumers. By basically in the next 20 years, that's intended for us. And zone 3, by the way, is basically just Iowa. That's intended to increase by 22 to 42 terawatt hours, a 30 to 60% increase, in other words, occurring over this exact same time frame. Again, back to this aspect of urgency. So not only urgency from the sense of trying to capture tax credits, but urgency in terms of that's a lot of generation that will be built between, I'll just say now and in the next 20 years, if these projections actually are correct. And there are a lot of things going into these projections. You have certainly a major one, which has been basically data centers projecting that they're going to have this massive increase in load due to AI. You have industrial sector that say they are also increasing over time. These have all been taken into account as these models have been run. So let's make things more complicated. So let's change the rules. So changing the rules, several things are occurring here as far as changes that impact, again, all these things simultaneously, same time. So it used to be that utilities, in order to demonstrate that they had capacity to supply all customers, they would have to meet, basically have capacity on board, accredited capacity is what it's called, to supply what your peak demand was from the previous year, plus a reserve margin of typically 15%. So reflect back to that chart I showed back where Iowa was almost entirely coal. So I had to have then accredited capacity at the coal plants that represented then the ability to meet my peak and 15% more. Well, because our generation mix is shifting more towards wind and solar, so the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, is changing the rules. And so they're changing the rules to utilize probabilistic modeling to determine what should we have basically then. And what this really means, as we translate that down, is that, for instance, for Iowa, the 2023-2024 modeling year, we had 12,659 megawatts of wind available to meet summer demand, but only 2,360 megawatts then counted towards meeting that accredited capacity that we have to have. So that certainly means then I probably have to build more. Well, if we take a look at this another way, so this is the analogy I would use. Basically, it was like yesterday, I believe my car could get me to my destination, but today I modeled it using a probability model and found out that basically my odds are much, much smaller and significantly less. And so what's the result? It means that in order to ensure that I have the ability to reach my destination, I have to buy additional cars. And so that'll reflect back too in terms of, again, the big beautiful bill, executive order, and just reminding us that those will impact basically all of this. Now, a further aspect of changing the rules, and this is basically a reflection that shows what I was talking about earlier here. And so each season basically now has its own accredited capacity. And so you'll note here that in the summer, basically at the top there. So in zone 3, again, Iowa, so there's a 12,659, and in fact, only 2,350 is actually being recognized then as accredited capacity. If we shift down to them where wind actually has better capacity factors in the winter. So that same 12,459 is now accredited then in the winter at 5,347 megawatts. By the way, this is also what they do now with solar. So the solar that we have will actually have a difference. And so for the solar, the summer capacity actually ends up being a higher value than, of course, the winter production and capacity factor. So what are we seeing right now in terms of the efforts to address all these changes? I mentioned basically then the accreditation difference, because part of what IPL, for instance, is having to do is when basically we saw then the reduction in accredited capacity, I believe 200 megawatts or somewhere right around there is actually what they're having to do just to come back up to the amount of capacity they actually need. Didn't mean that the customer base has changed at all. It just means that the rules have changed, and so now I had to have more to basically serve my customers. So for both basically Mid-American and Alliant, they both have basically done the resource evaluation studies, which is a study to determine, well, how much will I actually need over the next 20 years? And so there's both short-term and long-term aspects. What we're seeing first here is just the short-term aspects. So these basically are them being now in 2030. And both utilities are aggressively actually moving forward on all of these projects. And so Mid-American has a proposal out there right now for 800 megawatts of solar. So you see an approval of that. Also combustion turbines. Similarly, over on the IPL side, they just came forward with a proposal for the 1,000 megawatts of wind. They are moving forward on the battery storage, that's the BESS, so battery energy storage. They are moving forward on the gas peaking, and by the way, both facilities are basically also moving forward on their combined cycle. So that's near term. But what's this actually mean in terms of reflecting back to then that projected growth, potentially due to the data centers and industrial growth? Again, this is what I view as a staggering amount of energy and capacity that's going to be required in the next 20 years. So for Mid-American right now, that projection is over 7,000 megawatts. So Alliant, that's over 6,000 megawatts, almost 7. So for both utilities, roughly 7 gigawatts basically of new generation is being looked at as a need to meet these ongoing demands. Again, part of it is back to because we changed the rules regarding accreditation, but certainly growth is a major portion of what basically is being looked at. So concluding, so the threats to air quality, groundwater, surface water, posed by burning coal, it continues. basically both in economic harm, death of islands. That is certainly something, as I've noted before, that the plants aren't closing anytime soon, at least based on current projections, with basically all the way up to 2049. And so these impacts would continue. That if we look at this from a true and transparent accounting, whether it's Mid-American Alliance, the municipals, the cooperatives. By the way, I should note that the cooperatives, um, recognizing that the cooperatives that buy from the utilities it's Corn Belt and then Central Iowa Power. So those then sell that power or distribute that power then to your distribution cooperative. So in essence, almost all of the cooperatives, if you survey one of them, is being impacted or you're being impacted by this. And again, the municipals, but we should recognize then that that full range of costs is being borne by pretty much everyone, whether it's a health impact, whether it is basically, premature death. Those are all impacts that basically, when again, one of my principles, air discrimination, basically air pollution doesn't discriminate. It impacts everyone. So we have been a leader for over 20 years now in terms of deploying, wind. We're starting to see an increase in terms of solar production, which is also then helping us reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. We do have the wind and solar that we can reach 100% renewables. Certainly, we can bolster that with whether it is increasing transmission, whether it is as IPL is doing now, trying to basically bolster the storage aspects. But if we really want to achieve where I started, back to the aspects of climate change, this needs to be accomplished by 2035. So we have I'll just say a staggering basically mission ahead of us, where not only do we have to try and achieve the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but we have to try and do that while we're also trying to meet this increase in demand. Again, a huge task. But utilities really need to aggressively move right now. And even though this refers to the Inflation Reduction Act, just remember the underlying tax credits are still there. Really, all that's changed is, again, another change in rules as far as how long do I have to actually achieve and obtain that credit. Recognizing that even without the credit, the renewable generation will still be lower cost, but the credits certainly will have an impact and help customers overall. And by the way, I'll have one more plug for transmission. Transmission certainly has the ability to allow us to lower our costs by gaining access to not only our renewable resources, but those in other states. That. Turn it back to Jordan.
Great, thank you so much for that, Steve. And as you see on your screen here, there is a link, a QR code to get you to the report. You can also find that on the publications section of IEC's website. We do have some questions coming in here and encourage you to ask those in the Q&A tool. Steve, we'll start with this one first. How do you define the social costs in the study when we're talking about those externalities? What are those social costs?
Sure. So when we look at the social cost, it can be anything from basically impacts to whether it is the air we breathe, which is certainly a health impact cost. It can be anything from any type of impact. So, for instance, an impact would be as we see climate change affecting us as far as increased storm damage. That is certainly a social impact. So it's not, I'll just say, everything, but it certainly is a lot of the impacts we see as a result of climate change.
Great, thank you. I see two recent questions here that are fairly similar. To what extent do you expect the shortened timeline for wind and solar tax credits to curb future projects in the state, along with the private companies that are developing and installing these projects?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I wish I had the crystal ball on this one. Certainly, again, the utilities themselves, Mid-American and IPL, will be aggressively trying to certainly capture those with their current projects. There are a number of developers that have projects, I'll just say, sitting in the wings that have previously received approval already from the Utilities Commission, and are just frankly sitting there waiting for someone to actually purchase that project. So potentially that's an avenue where they could aggressively move forward that way. Developers. Yeah, I mean, excellent question. I mean, developers have the unfortunate aspect of having to compete if they're going to sell not the project, but the energy, compete in the marketplace. And so that will all depend on, frankly, the need we have for the energy. It's very possible that as we look at this rapid increase in demand, they may be viable, even without those tax credits. But again, crystal balling this, it's sort of hard to tell what impact will really occur. Other than I'll go back to the aspects as that if I'm the utility, I will certainly continue to look at renewables because they provide a lower cost of operation.
Great, thank you, Steve. I'm going to add this as a follow-up question here. Can you talk to how the tariffs are affecting the cost and supply of renewable energy materials in Iowa?
Yeah, I mean, I won't say I know exactly, other than I know that it's having an impact. Uh, Certainly, the tariffs. If I take a look at a wind turbine is almost all steel, and it'd be nice, sure, if all that steel was available here in the U.S., but it's not. And so, as that steel is imported, that certainly is going to increase the cost of building that turbine. That's even if that turbine is being built in the U.S. If that turbine is being produced in a foreign country, yeah, that's going to have a huge impact. In fact, it probably pushes that wind turbine out of the range of feasibility to even produce. On the solar side, similar. I mean, solar panels. Certainly, if there were enough capacity to meet demand from U.S. manufacturers, then that wouldn't be that much of an impact. But right now, there's not. And again, back to this aspect of looking at this rapid increase in need and load. They're already having some impact, and I suspect that they will have an increased impact as we move forward. I will point out too that not only the impact of tariffs, but as we look at other forms of generation, and so when both, for instance, IPL and Mid-American have been looking at, for instance, putting in natural gas. Natural gas, even though that seems to be the fallback right now as a generation source, the companies that build these turbines are seeing significant lead times. There's so much demand for them that you would be lucky right now if you could see that turbine show up 3 to 4 years from now. Some of what I've seen says the turbines are already now being pushed out to 7 years. So again, that's that aspect in terms of 20 years. 7 years is a large portion of basically what 20 years represents. So coming to a pinch point.
Thank you, Steve. I'll stick with federal policy with this question. Given changes to funding from the One Beautiful Bill Act, do you think that we're still can be on track to make a net zero by 2050 goal or a carbon-free energy or electricity by 2035 goal in those timeframes? Or how significantly will these changes set us back?
I mean, the way I view it again goes back to the aspects of how we want to actually generate electricity. And so if I look at basically trying to achieve my lowest cost of operation, lowest cost generation, I'm going to try and increase basically the amount of renewable generation. Recognizing too that when I talk about that increased demand, a lot of data centers are obviously looking at this themselves. And so that demand may be handled by that data center themselves. They may put a facility at their own location that then eliminates that portion from the utility having to meet that demand. If I'm sort of projecting the ability to meet that, I think the biggest thing is there's no plan. So right now, all we have is lofty statements with no real plan to actually achieve it.
Thank you very much. I have a few questions here that are fairly similar, so I'm going to group them together. Looking at future load, can you give us more insight on how those numbers are calculated? And there's an interest here in seeing, what goes into those calculations. The second similar question is, do these projections take into potential load growth from data centers?
So answering that first, yes. And I'll just say, recognizing that these are projections from again MISO, from the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. They get their information from then the utilities themselves that are members of MISO. So, and I'll say that is somewhat of a black box. So I mean, we'll see the end result that shows us the 22, to 40, or the 22 to 42, but we don't actually see the inputs the utilities actually provide them. So, so I wish I could answer that, but I do know that yes, in fact, the data centers are certainly a large portion of what they are accounting for.
Thank you, Steve. We have another question looking at the MISO accreditation change. And the question is MISO saying that renewables are more risky so that there needs to be even more production of wind, solar, and storage to ensure that electricity is available for customers?
Somewhat. So what the model does is it utilizes weather data to then, again, run the model and determine by a probability aspect theory of when do I have the ability to actually meet generation at particular points and places. And so as it models that, again, yeah, I mean, it's weighing the odds. It's just basically based on weather data. Will I know whether or not I'm going to have wind available to meet all my demand at a particular point in time? And then it has to meet a certain criteria. So I believe it has to meet a 6 minutes per year criteria that says I have to be able to model enough that the only time that I say I'm without electricity is 6 minutes per year. But yeah, if I want to go back to the aspect, yeah, again, I'm going to go back to transmission because that's one of the things that transmission provides is then the geographic diversity to be able to overcome some of what the model is showing us.
Great, thank you. I think that might conclude the questions that we currently have asked. Maybe we can give it one more moment to see if we have a final one. And maybe we won't, and that's okay. We appreciate the great questions that folks have asked, and this is a continuing conversation for us. It's really great to have seen this report evolve over 5 years and really tell the story of energy production in Iowa. We'll end on one last question for you, Steve. The question is the timeline for homeowner tax credits the end of this year? So those consumer-facing credits for solar, how are those affected?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, the Section 25 credits are ending at the end of this year. And for those that are interested, unlike the commercial side where you just have to start construction, on the residential side, you have to have your project operational by the end of this year to qualify for those credits.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for handling all those questions and for the information you shared with us. Folks, please keep in touch. Visit our site if you haven't already seen the full report. And we look forward to getting this out there a little bit further and increasing Iowans' understanding of our energy system. It's very good to be with you. Thank you very much.